I want to show you a video that proves evolution and common descent beyond all reasonable doubt, no question about it. You'd have to be crazy not to believe in evolution after seeing this video. And what is the evidence? Endogenous retroviruses. That's right, this video claims that endogenous retroviruses proves evolution, no question about it. Now, this is actually an old argument, and I've made a video on endogenous retroviruses. You can see that. I'll put the link down below. But this video is convincing a lot of people. It's highly produced, and it's getting attention. So I want to look at this video specifically. So let's have a look.
Evidence for evolution in your own DNA, endogenous retroviruses.
So the video is about endogenous retroviruses. However, it begins with a much broader claim. Let's have a look.
Dr. Francis Collins, the man who directed the Human Genome Project, rightfully pointed out that the study of DNA gives us an entirely independent, quantifiable way to test our ideas about evolution. Instead of simply taking his word for it, here we will examine the evidence for ourselves.
So the video begins with this broad, triumphant statement from Francis Collins. Let's take another look at it. Quote, "If there was any lingering doubt about the evidence from the fossil record, the study of DNA provides the strongest possible proof of our relatedness to all other living things." So in other words, what Collins is saying here is that the fossils are powerful evidence for evolution, and DNA is even more powerful evidence for evolution. Now, this is just simply false. Any life scientist knows this. This is not controversial. The evidence is significantly problematic for evolution. Let's take a look at a sampling of fossil evidence and DNA evidence. I just want to take a few minutes here and play a snippet from a presentation I once gave going over some of these evidences. So what I'm going to do is run through a series of snapshots of the scientific evidence and just see how does the scientific evidence bear on the theory of evolution. The first one, microRNA. You've heard of genes. Genes are usually used to make proteins. About 25 years ago, some particularly short genes were discovered. About 20 nucleotides long, if you remember that from high school biology, nucleotides. Those short genes are used to make microRNAs, and microRNAs regulate the creation of proteins. They can slow down, they can put the process on pause. Of course, those microRNAs can't just be on all the time. They can't just be going all the time. They need to be regulated. And so there are proteins that regulate the microRNA. It's a very interesting process, kind of a chicken and the egg thing going on here. You got the proteins, you got the regulators, they're regulating each other. Very, very interesting. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, when they discovered these microRNA genes, the idea, the hope, the expectation was that they should fall into an evolutionary pattern. That is, the microRNA genes for neighboring species should be similar. MicroRNAs for distant species should be different. That's just the typical way evolution works. Well, it didn't happen that way. It didn't work that way. The microRNA genes conflicted with the evolutionary tree. A paper where they're looking for microRNA genes, and the typical strategy for an evolutionist is to use nearby species. If you're looking for microRNA genes in species A, you look at the microRNA genes that are already known to exist in neighboring similar species. And you say, okay, they're going to be similar in this organism. Use the neighbors. That's the whole idea in evolution. Neighbors are going to be similar. It didn't work. It hindered the discovery of microRNA genes. And so these researchers wrote in this journal paper that they liberated themselves. We liberated ourselves from the conservation requirement, that is, the evolutionary requirement. We decided to liberate ourselves from that. These findings strongly suggest a wide-ranging, species-specific microRNA-ome. What does that mean, species-specific? That means different for neighboring species. exactly the opposite of what you would expect from an evolutionary perspective. Okay. Now, I don't want you to leave here thinking, okay, there's this interesting new problem that was discovered 25 years ago, and evolutionists will work on it. Otherwise, we've got this theory that is working really well. The microRNA incongruencies are typical. It's not just microRNA. I give you that example because it's kind of a neat example. It's kind of recent. Oh, cool. Molecular data in general do not support the evolutionary tree. MicroRNAs are not the exception. They are the rule. Here's a paper. Evolutionary trees from biological molecules often do not resemble those from morphology. What's morphology? That's the visible features, the bones, the muscles. So if you take and you build a traditional evolutionary trees are constructed from the morphological features. You take the fish, the birds, the mammals, and you create an evolutionary tree based on what you see, and you dissect the organisms, and you build up the knowledge of the design, and you put them into an evolutionary tree. Now that we've discovered the molecular data, we're looking under the hood, they don't match. That is a major incongruency in evolution, for evolution. According to evolution, the molecular and morphological data should agree. They don't. The microRNA is just one example. Here's another paper. The growing gap between the molecules and the fossils is astounding. Astounding. Here's another paper. There are major disparities between the molecules and the fossils, and solutions to this problem are elusive. Elusive. Here's another interesting paper that looked at something called the consistency index. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but the point is these data points on this graph should be up close to the top of this graph. At the top is a 1. The consistency index goes from 0 to 1. Each data point is a study of 30, 40, 50 species, and it's looking at how the incongruencies. It's looking at the incongruencies in that group of species. You want to have very few incongruencies. If there are very few incongruencies, you're going to have a consistency index of 1 or close to 1. What you see is that these data points consistently, pun intended here, very consistently are not even close to 1. And you want to be looking toward the right-hand side because that's the meaningful studies where you have more species in the study. You're looking at 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. Those are terrible fits. What I just talked to a minute ago was kind of some different papers, quotes from different papers. This is more systematic. This is looking at a lot of species, a lot of studies here, a lot of data is packed into this graph. And the data are not anywhere close to where the evolutionary expectation is. What's the point of all this that I'm telling you? The scientific evidence contradicts the theory. Of course, I'm just talking about the molecules here. But that's what I've been telling you. The evidence, the scientific evidence is contradicting the theory. They're not meshing. Now, what we're usually told in our biology classes and in our media is, this is a no-brainer. All the evidence. Question? No.
When you say scientific data and you're looking at...
So the earlier ones that I showed you a minute ago were molecular sequences, DNA sequences. This one is more encompassing. Here's another paper. Incongruities. I explained incongruities. That's where it's not working. Incongruities can be seen everywhere in the universal tree. Everywhere. Now, I don't want you to leave here today and think, well, okay, so, this guy talked about incongruities in the evolutionary tree. You got some problems in the evolutionary tree. I'm sure evolutionists are working on this. They're going to figure this out. It's a thorn. It's an interesting problem. But otherwise, evolution is, a strong, obvious, compelling theory. The evolutionary tree problem is the tip of the iceberg. It's just the tip of the iceberg. It's something that we can kind of understand, get our hands around, so I showed that example. There's many, many, many more problems with the theory of evolution. It's not the exception, but the rule. Evolution's another way to judge a theory, another way to scientifically evaluate from a dispassionate perspective. Again, I'm fine with evolution being true. It's not a big deal to me. But a good way to objectively evaluate a theory is to look at its predictions. Look at the predictions that have been made. Now, we've had 150 years since Darwin, so we've had a lot of predictions from evolutionists. So it's had some time, and we've had some time to check this out. The predictions from that mainstream consensus evolutionists have made have consistently failed. They've failed over and over again. So there is substantial scientific evidence that does not support evolution and common descent. Not only does the video begin with a misleading claim about the evidence, but it hides contradictory evidence. Now look, I get it that theory proponents want to put their theory in the best light. They describe problems with the theory as exceptions or anomalies, research problems that are being worked on. Don't worry, we'll figure this out. And then they describe successes of the theory as normative. This is what you should be looking at. So I get that. But if you're going to make a video about the evidence and why it proves evolution, then you have to engage in these evidences and be honest about them. So in other words, the video claims herbs prove evolution while failing to mention there is a plethora of contradictory evidence and falsely stating otherwise. This is not a very good start.
Here, we'll zoom in on just one line of DNA evidence: endogenous retrovirus DNA shared across species. In this case, between humans and chimpanzees.
So what are endogenous retroviruses? Well, the key words here are retro and endogenous. Retro meaning that the genetic information in the virus gets copied into your DNA, into the genome of one of your cells. Endogenous meaning that that cell in question is a sex cell, such that the virus information ultimately makes its way to your progeny. If you have children, they will inherit that virus information into their DNA.
If, however, a retrovirus happens to infect a sperm cell or egg cell, and if that sperm or egg cell ends up participating in fertilization, the resulting child will have a copy of virus DNA in every single one of her cells. She'll even pass it on to her kids if she has children.
Well, wait a minute. What the video did not explain is that this process is a problem for evolution. Insertion into DNA is done with the help of a machine called reverse transcriptase. Reverse transcriptase is a complicated protein machine. It's too complicated to have evolved by random mutations, one after the other, adding up to luckily find this design. Furthermore, even if you were to somehow luckily evolve this reverse transcriptase machine, it would not be selected for. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't help anything because it needs to be regulated. You would somehow luckily have to have the regulation machinery in place as well. And furthermore, you would need to have the genetic material that the reverse transcriptase is going to help to insert into the DNA. In the case of a virus, that's other genes that the virus uses. So there's just too many things going on here to evolve by random mutation, unguided mutations. In other words, evolution struggles to explain retroviruses. So the video claims retroviruses prove evolution, whereas in fact, evolution cannot explain retroviruses. So this isn't very good so far. But the basic argument is that evolution predicts the same endogenous retroviruses in the same genome location in different species. Let's listen.
If humans and chimps share a common ancestor, and if at least some of the infections we find in our genome occurred before the chimp-human split, we should find the same virus genes in the exact same locations in both human and chimp genomes.
But this is not true. Evolution does not require or predict the same endogenous retroviruses in the same genome location in different species, as the video just said. How do I know this? Because when it fails, evolutionists always have an explanation. In other words, when the endogenous retroviruses do not show up in the common descent pattern, but rather some other pattern, evolutionists are always able to explain it. X, Y, or Z did that. So evolution can explain X and not X. And it isn't much of a credit to your theory if you observe X, but your theory is just fine with X or not X. And the explanations have no limit. Hold that thought. We will see an example in this very video in just a moment. So a lot of big problems so far, but we're still warming up. Let's now look at the actual calculation of why this is supposed to be such powerful evidence for evolution.
If two individuals are both infected with just 12 of the same viruses, the chance that each of those 12 inserted themselves into the exact same DNA locations in both hosts is less than 1 in the number of all the atoms estimated to exist in the entire observable universe.
So what are they saying here? Even a mere 12 endogenous retroviruses in 2 species proves evolution beyond any shadow of a doubt. Why? Because statistically, there is no way those common elements in different species could have occurred by chance. They just demolished evolution. What do I mean by that? Well, common elements occurring by chance in massive numbers is exactly what evolution requires. It's called convergent evolution, and it's a problem that's been around for a long time, been known about for a long time, back to Darwin's day. George Mivart in 1871 scathingly criticized Darwin's new theory, and this was one of his problems, one of his criticisms. Let's read what he wrote here. On this theory, Darwinism, the chances are almost infinitely great against the independent, accidental occurrence and preservation of 2 similar series of minute variations, resulting in the independent development of 2 closely similar forms. Sound familiar? This is exactly the argument we just saw from the video. Different wording, of course, but it's the same idea. Now, there are other problems with the video we will see in a minute, but the point here is that they take one side of an argument here to make their point about endogenous retroviruses, whereas elsewhere, when it comes to convergent evolution, they take the exact opposite side of the argument. And they must take the exact opposite side of the argument to save the theory of evolution. Now, Mivart was just the beginning. While Mivart argued that there are, quote, multitudes of examples of convergence, he was aware of only a small fraction of the convergences that would later be discovered. Today, convergence is known to be ubiquitous in biology. Simon Conway Morris is another evolutionist who has grappled with this problem and has recognized that this just isn't working. There has to be some other way to understand all of this convergence in biology. The point here is that if common elements across species cannot arise independently, then evolution is false. Okay, next the video moves on from the hypothetical case of 12 common endogenous retroviruses to some empirical data. Let's have a look.
To get a rough idea of how many insertions are shared between humans and chimps, researchers scanned both of our genomes looking for a type of retrovirus they knew was common in humans. They found 211 insertions in the human genome and 208 in chimpanzees.
Now also the video further explains that 9 endogenous retroviruses were lineage specific. In other words, I think there were 6 that were in the human genome, but not the chimp, and then 3 that were only in the chimp. So they were hypothesized to have inserted after the chimp-human split. So after the chimp-human split, you had 6 infections in the human and 3 in the chimp. Okay, what the video did not say is that there are a total of 15 endogenous retroviruses that simply do not fit the common descent pattern. They must have inserted at some point in the proposed evolutionary history, but they don't show up in all of the species downstream of that, and so they must have been deleted somehow. They require ad hoc explanations, these 15 endogenous retroviruses. And the paper addresses that. So this is something that the video does not share with you. And reading from the paper here, the absence of an entire endogenous retrovirus insertion in some primates could be due to an integration having occurred after the separation of the respective evolutionary lineages, thus providing direct information, etc., etc. So that's what I just mentioned a moment ago, where you have 6 in the human and 3 in the chimpanzee. So those occurred after the separation of the lineages. That explains those. This does not explain the 15 endogenous retroviruses that simply don't fit the pattern. So this is not relevant. Let's continuing with their explanation. It could, however, also depend on deletions, rearrangements, errors in genome sequence assemblies, or errors in their comparative analysis, particularly for primate species. Okay, so here they've thrown in everything but the kitchen sink. You can explain anything. You've got deletions, you've got rearrangements. In other words, after a retrovirus insertion, it can then move around, and we've got millions of years to work with, so retroviruses can move around, they can be deleted, and also, if we really have an awkward situation, we can just doubt the data itself, the data themselves. So the data are in error. The genome sequence assembly, something may have gone wrong there. If in doubt, just blame the data or even the analysis that was done afterwards. So you can explain anything with all of these explanatory mechanisms evolutionists bring to bear. Remember, a moment ago, I said we will see an example of how evolution is okay with any sort of pattern, and we'll see that here it is. This is it. So you have endogenous retroviruses that don't fit the pattern. The paper proposes a battery of potential explanatory mechanisms, that together can explain any sort of pattern. And so evolution is okay with practically any sort of outcome. Anything can be explained. So recall the earlier quote prediction that I addressed a few moments ago. Furthermore, one endogenous retrovirus that they looked at in the paper is interesting. It's absent in 3 species, the chimp, gorilla, and gibbon, while present in 3 species, the human, orangutan, and rhesus. So this one is going to be even more of a problem. In other words, this endogenous retrovirus must have independently gone missing in the chimp, also in the gorilla, and in the gibbon, but not in those other 3 species. So it inserted, because it's in those 3 species, it inserted long ago upstream in the evolutionary tree, but then was deleted in these 3 different species. The probability of that is small. It's 2 chances in 1,000 approximately. So this is what happens. You have ad hoc explanations, and you have things that are not probable with evolutionary theory. The video ignores these problems and does not tell you about them, and calculates an astronomical probability as before. So let's listen.
When we do the math, even making sure to account for the 9 viruses not shared by the 2 species, the chance of this happening by coincidence is less than 1 in this crazy number right here. This evidence should be enough for even the most reluctant yet rational person to carefully set aside the fixed species view.
Okay, a huge number. So any, quote, rational person should set aside the fixed species view. Again, this argument demolishes evolution because this is exactly what evolution requires. What the video says is impossible is exactly what evolution requires, as I pointed out a few moments ago. So far, we have seen that the video is riddled with problems, but that was just a warm-up. Now we come to the real problem. The video says any, quote, rational person should set aside the fixed species view. Notice that the subject is the fixed species view. Nothing about these endogenous retroviruses actually helps evolutionary theory, actually helps to prove or make evolutionary theory more likely, or so forth. It is an argument against a different theory, a proof by the process of elimination. You have theories A and B. If I can disprove B, then only A is left. Darwin's one long argument is a contrastive argument. So in other words, this endogenous retrovirus video and its argument, which is not a new argument, this has been around, is typical. This mode of argument is contrastive, and that's all of the strong arguments Darwin used and evolutionists have subsequently used fall into this category. They are contrastive arguments arguing against a different theory. The strong arguments for evolution are contrastive, where theory B is creationism. So let's summarize this in some bullets here. This argument entails omniscience of all alternative theories. In other words, this process of elimination, if I'm going to argue that theory B is false, so therefore A must be true, that only makes sense if A and B are the only possibilities. They are complementary and they are exhaustive. You have A, you have B, there's nothing else possible. Even unknown theories are impossible. I know that only A and B can explain the world. That's it, the biological world. There's no other possibilities. This requires omniscience. This doesn't come from science. There's no scientific experiment that can tell you that knowledge. That's extra scientific knowledge or metaphysical knowledge. And it is omniscient. The only way you can know of all possible explanations is to be omniscient. Second bullet here, it entails religious claims about how God creates. Now, this draws upon the history of evolutionary thought. I've done dozens of videos on this. This endogenous retrovirus argument and arguments like it fall right into the history of evolutionary thought. So I can't go into that in this video. It would be too long. But this goes back to the history of evolutionary thought and the religious claims behind it that were so prevalent in Darwin's work and are prevalent in today's evolutionary literature as well. I'll put links down below to my papers on that you can look at, but I also have a lot of videos on that. Third bullet here, evolution uses a straw man for theory B. So what they're using, this static model for theory B, is really a silly cardboard two-dimensional model that is convenient. If you're going to use the process of elimination, it's awfully convenient to make a theory B that's easy to knock down. Okay, next bullet here. An unstated premise is that there are no other theories are even possible, even unconceived theories. I mentioned that earlier, but to make the point here. They don't say that, but they don't tell you that. The video does not inform you about that. That's an unstated premise, that there are no other theories even possible. Next bullet, what is being tested here is not evolution. It's a two-dimensional static world model. Next bullet, yet another key unstated premise is that either the world is static or evolution is true. That's it. Those are your choices. This simplistic static model, or else evolution is true. There are no other choices. Now, how do they know this? None of this comes from science, as I pointed out. There's no scientific experiment that can tell you this. So the problem is not with the math. All their math is correct. All those zeros come out of their equations. The problem is in their formulation, their framing of the problem. You're supposed to be impressed by all the zeros and swayed by all the zeros and forget about the shell game that went on before that to set that up. It sounds very powerful, but it is metaphysical. This is not science. So it is the metaphysics that provides the power for their triumphant conclusion. Let's listen.
We are family.
We are part of this very complicated amazing evolutionary history. We are related to those other animals, especially animals like non-human primates like the chimpanzees. We are directly descended from a common ancestor. The evidence for that is overwhelming. That evolutionary mechanism by which life has spread across this planet and all of its amazing diversity over something like 4 billion years is about as well established as anything I know in science. So if somebody wants to tell you, well, evolution's just a theory and it'll probably go away someday, it's about as likely to go away as gravity is. It is extremely well supported, and particularly so by the study of DNA.
Okay, very impressive, but this is all false. It is false that endogenous retroviruses prove evolution. The video is one long deception. From a scientific perspective, evolution is problematic. The triumph of evolution is metaphysical, not scientific. You need to understand this. You cannot allow yourself to be tossed about and fooled by every wind of doctrine and deceit that comes along. Religion drives science, and it matters.